Okay, here we are with the culture and religion in Eurasia and North Africa, 500 BCE to 500 CE. We're going to look at the cultural traditions of classical India. Okay, Indian cultural development was quite different. The elite culture was rather enthusiastic about the divine and about spiritual matters. And Hinduism, the main Indian religious tradition, actually had no historical founder. It developed along with the Indian civilization, spread into Southeast Asia, but really remained associated with India and Indians above all else. And it was actually never a single tradition, as Hinduism is a term invented by outsiders. Alright, South Asian religion, from ritual sacrifice to philosophical speculation. Now, it's widely recognized that the sacred text provided some common ground within the diversity of Indian culture and religion. The Vedas, which are poems, hymns, prayers, rituals, were compiled by Brahmins, or priests, and transmitted orally. The Vedas, like I said, they were initially passed down by oral tradition, and they really give a detailed insight into the early South Asian world where social hierarchy and religious ritual were rather important. Now, they were not written down in Sanskrit until about 600 BCE, but it's considerably older than that. And like I said, it provides a really good glimpse of Indian civilization. There were competing chiefdoms and kingdoms, a clear patriarchal society, although it's less restrictive than later periods. And the role of the Brahmins in practicing these elaborate ritual sacrifices is what gave them power and wealth above many of the other citizens. And the Upanishads, or mystical philosophical works, developed in response to the dissatisfaction with the Brahmins. As the lower classes began to react increasingly negatively to the elite's emphasis on social status and ritual obligation, a body of texts by various anonymous authors arose that focused more on mystical and philosophical issues than on formal rituals, and that was the Upanishads. It was composed between 800 and 400 BCE, and it probes the inner meaning of the Vedic sacrifices, or introspection. And the central idea of Brahman, notice the spelling, or world soul, is the ultimate reality. And the Atman, or the individual human soul, is part of the Brahman. And I notice that should be Brahman. And the ultimate goal of Moksha was the union of the Atman, or the individual soul, with Brahman, the world soul. And achieving union involved many lifetimes. So the Upanishads taught that individual human souls were just really a part of a greater world soul. And the eternal unity of Brahman was the true reality, and the divisions and diversities of the material world were actually an illusion. Now, samsara, or reincarnation, rebirth, was central to this process of achieving the union. And karma is what governed the samsara. So, karma, or good deeds, governed the samsara, this process of reincarnation, in order to achieve union between the individual soul and the Brahman soul, called moksha. Now, Hinduism legitimated and expressed India's gender system. Women increasingly were forbidden to learn the Vedas and participate in public rituals. And the law of Manu defined women as beholden to men in every phase of life. So the social implications of this worldview endorsed caste distinctions and hierarchy, as well as patriarchy. And women came to be seen as unclean and dirty, and thus became inferior. And the laws of Manu institutionalized these inequalities and promoted young girls to marrying older men, wives being obedient, widows never remarrying, and even the sexual pleasure was the legitimate goal for men and women as detailed in the Kama Sutra. And many Hindu deities were also female. And these cults and deities had different paths. Hinduism, as the many diverse traditions of South Asia came to be known, recognized that there were many paths to the divine. Of the huge number of gods and goddesses of widely different character and temperament, various devotional cults developed, and often they would draw women or lower class men who felt left out of the practices from the upper classes that emphasized ritual and social hierarchy. And so really there were multiple paths to fulfill anyone's Hindu religious thought. And the Brahmin priests, and especially the wandering ascetics, really spread these ideas. Alright, now let's talk about the Buddhist challenge. The Buddhist challenge developed side by side with philosophical Hinduism. It's founded by Siddhartha Gautama around 566 to about 486 BCE. He said that there's this spiritual journey that could take one to enlightenment or insight. And he really discovered this at age 35. And his followers saw him as the Buddha, or the enlightened one. So Buddhism, unlike the collection of traditions known as Hinduism, Buddhism has a historical founding figure. He was a North Indian prince that lived a life of opulence until he encountered examples of sickness and old age and death, and then he went on this spiritual quest until achieving enlightenment. And he spent the remainder of his life teaching this message. Now, what was central to Buddhist teaching is that life is suffering. Sorrow's cause is craving for individual fulfillment, so it attaches to oneself, and the cure is with modest and moral life and meditation. And the goal is to achieve enlightenment or nirvana, extinguishing the individual identity, basically. And so the Buddhist central teachings is that, life is suffering and it could be ended by basically ending desire. The enlightened state could be achieved by following the Buddhist path, at which one point one's individual identity would fuse basically with the larger whole, and all individual desires and delusions would vanish. And communities of monks formed to follow these teachings. Now, there are several elements of Hinduism that are present in Buddhist teaching. Life as an illusion, the idea of karma and rebirth, and overcoming the demands of the ego, both practices of meditation, and hope for release from the cycle of rebirth. So Buddhism kind of stemmed from Hinduism and shared many key concepts such as the illusion of the material world, like I said, rebirth and karma, the goal of release from the individual identity, and even the fusion with the larger world soul is shared between both faiths. And while both practice meditation, Buddhism was much less tied and even hostile to rituals and the idea of caste. But some might refer to Buddhism as a simplified and more accessible form of Hinduism. Now, there's a lot of Buddhism that challenged Hinduism, and the rejection of the Brahmins' religious authority, the lack of interest in abstract speculation, and even the need for individuals to take responsibility for their own spiritual development. This was very new, and it also challenged the inequalities of the caste system, which is so ingrained in Indian society. Now, while at first opposed, the Buddha ultimately allowed separate female orders of nuns. The rules are clearly subordinated the nuns to the men, and the Buddha viewed women as an obstacle, basically, to male enlightenment. The nuns found relative freedom and independence in some of these monasteries, and it appealed especially to the lower castes in India and women. The teaching was in their local language, not the classical Sanskrit, and it really links the local traditions with the establishment of monasteries and stupas, or shrines, with the relics of the Buddha. And there was a lot of support from Ashoka, an Indian leader, in, his reign was about 268 to 232 BCE. Of course, when you receive support from the ruler, that makes a significant difference. So there were restrictions and opportunities for women. Initially, the Buddha, like I said, didn't allow them into the community of monks, but after some pressure, he allowed them to establish communities for nuns. Like I said, they were subordinate to male monks. And nonetheless, women have found more opportunities for spiritual fulfillment than in male-dominated Hindu communities. And there's a popular appeal. Eschewing the Hinduism elite language of Sanskrit for the popular loose Pali, the Buddhist teachings were accessible to the less educated social classes, a rejection of the caste system, and the establishment of the stupas and shrines as sacred sites to visit. And Ashoka, with his support, he basically allowed for a promotion of the Buddhist faith, and that helped win many converts and establish the faith as distinct from Hinduism. But there was a split within Buddhism. In early Buddhism, the Theravada was the teaching of the elders. This is the original branch of Buddhism. It focused on wisdom passed down through monks, and while not denying their existence, there was little talk of actual gods, and the Buddha was not portrayed as a god. But by early in the Common Era, there's the development of Mahayana, or the Great Vehicle. This branch of Buddhism began to take on aspects even of the supernatural. The Buddha became a godlike figure, and there were believed to be numerous bodhisattvas who had achieved enlightenment but stayed in the material world to help others achieve enlightenment. And these bodhisattvas became the subject of popular veneration. And eventually, Hinduism, as it was this religion of duty and devotion, kind of gradually incorporated into Hinduism in India. Excuse me. Mahayana Buddhism, in particular, spread elsewhere in Asia. In the first millennium CE, that first 1,000 years, there's a development of a more popular Hinduism in response to that, and expressed in some epic poems like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Action in the world and performance of these caste duties provide a path to liberation, for example. And the Bhakti, or worship movement, that began in South India. Now I'm going to come back up here and talk about these for a second. These texts contained epic stories of battle and human interacting with deities that were both widely entertaining, but more importantly provided a popular communication of Hindu teachings to the masses. Stories such as that of the warrior Arjuna and his charioteer, Lord Krishna, was an incarnation of Vishnu, and gave people, the common people, an example of following. Right? And they could see the moral obligations in the world as a path towards fulfilling one's spiritual duty. Now, Bhakti, which means worship, this movement involved intense and passionate songs and prayers and rituals towards these gods like Vishnu and Shiva and Krishna. And often this form of expression was open to all, regardless of caste and gender. And that's another reason why it became so popular. In Buddhism, it kind of just sucked back into Hinduism in India as it faced competition from Islam, was developing further west, and some concern about the wealth of the monasteries, but mostly because Hinduism is a tolerant faith that could incorporate and absorb Buddhism. The Buddha came to be viewed as the 9th incarnation of Vishnu, and veneration of the Buddha became similar to the veneration of other deities. So we see a lot of commonalities between the two. And that concludes Section 2, Cultural Traditions of Classical India.